That fire is a violation of Covenant Section 3, Article 4, Subsection B, and you, sir, are in for a world of financial pain you cannot possibly comprehend," she bellowed, her voice a shrill instrument of pure, unadulterated entitlement that cut through the crisp autumn air. The sound was so jarring it was a wonder the squirrels didn't fall out of the oak trees. Her name was Karen, of course it was, and she stood there on the edge of my property line, a solid, immovable monument to suburban tyranny, clad in a pastel pink tracksuit that was fighting a losing battle against her formidable frame. Her hands were planted firmly on her hips. Her face was a blotchy canvas of indignation, and she pointed a trembling, manicured finger at the neat, controlled pile of brush. I was burning a good 200 yards away from her precious kingdom of beige vinyl siding. The smoke, thin and white, drifted lazily upwards, a stark contrast to the thick cloud of fury emanating from the self-appointed queen of the estates at Whispering Pines. I had lived here, on my own 20 acres of unincorporated land, bordering this HOA, for nearly a year, and this was our first, and I suspected, most memorable interaction. I calmly turned the log in the fire pit with a long steel poker, letting the embers shower upwards into the darkening sky before I even deigned to look at her. The fire wasn't just for clearing brush. It was a ritual, a connection to the land my family had owned for 3 generations before I bought this parcel back, a piece of quiet solace after 20 years in the Army Corps of Engineers. This land, this fire, this peace, it was mine, and she was trespassing on all of it. If you've ever had a run-in with an HOA president who thinks their jurisdiction extends to the curvature of the earth, go ahead and hit that subscribe button and tell me your own nightmare story in the comments below. I want to hear where you're watching from, and no, I'm not alone in this fight for basic property rights. Now let me tell you how this woman's little power trip ended up costing her and her cronies everything. My name is Jack, and for 2 decades, my world was defined by regulations, logistics, and chain of command. I built bridges in war zones and managed infrastructure projects that had zero margin for error. When I retired, I didn't want a townhome with a postage stamp lawn governed by a committee that debated the acceptable shades of taupe for a front door. I wanted land. I wanted the freedom to wake up and hear nothing but the wind in the pines. So I bought back this 20-acre plot, a piece of the original family farmstead that had been sold off in the 70s. It was perfect, a mix of old-growth forest and open meadow, bordered on one side by a state forest and on the other, unfortunately, by the recently developed estates at Whispering Pines. I knew about the HOA. I'd read their covenants before I closed on my land, just to know what kind of neighbors I'd have. It was a masterpiece of petty restrictions, a 200-page document dedicated to enforcing a bland and suffocating conformity. But it didn't apply to me. My property was never part of their plat. My deed was recorded 50 years before their developer ever broke ground. I was an island of sovereign territory on their manicured border, and until today, my existence had been a quiet one. I'd spent months clearing undergrowth, thinning out invasive species, and creating fire breaks, responsible land management. The pile of brush I was burning was the culmination of that work, a necessary and legal step to mitigate wildfire risk. I had my burn permit from the state, my water hoses were charged, my fire break was clear, and the wind was favorable. I was, by every legal and professional metric, conducting a textbook-controlled burn. But Karen's metric was different. Her metric was whether or not she could see it from her back patio, and if she could, she had to control it. That first encounter set the tone for everything that was to follow. It was a declaration of war, not over a fire, but over the fundamental question of who had authority over my land. Her, with her binder of arbitrary rules, or me, with my deed, my knowledge, and the law on my side. She had no idea who she was picking a fight with. She saw a guy in a flannel shirt and work boots tending a fire. She didn't see a man who had spent his entire adult life dismantling complex problems, outplanning adversaries, and navigating bureaucracies far more terrifying than her little homeowners association. She thought she was bringing a fine to a firefight. I was about to bring a strategic plan. The first official salvo arrived 3 days after our initial confrontation, delivered by a certified mail carrier who looked at me with an expression of profound pity. It was a thick, cream-colored envelope embossed with the ostentatious Whispering Pines logo, a single, weeping pine tree that looked vaguely depressed. Inside was a 4-page letter written in the kind of condescending legalese that only a layperson drunk on power could concoct. It was a formal notice of violation and intent to fine, and it was a work of art. Karen, in her official capacity as HOA president, had meticulously detailed my supposed transgressions. I was in violation of Section 3, Community Nuisances, Article 4, Fire, Smoke, and Odors, Subsection B, Open burning of yard waste. The letter accused me of creating a hazardous condition, producing noxious fumes, and blatantly disregarding the aesthetic harmony of the community. It was a symphony of buzzwords designed to sound intimidating and official. The best part, the absolute pièce de resistance, was the fine schedule. My initial offense was assessed at $500. A subsequent violation would be $1,000. A third would result in legal action to compel compliance, with all associated legal fees billed to the offending property owner. Attached were 2 blurry photos of my smoke plume, taken from what must have been her second-story window, presented as if they were evidence from a crime scene. She had even included a neatly printed remittance slip. I sat at my kitchen table, the letter spread out before me, and I didn't feel anger. I felt a strange sense of calm, the same feeling I used to get before a complex mission. It was the feeling of a problem presenting itself, a problem with clear parameters and a clear objective. The objective was not just to win, it was to dismantle the entire illegitimate foundation of her authority. She had made the classic mistake of every overconfident tyrant. She had underestimated her opponent and, in doing so, had handed me all the ammunition I would ever need. The letter was a gift. It was a signed, dated, and officially documented record of the HOA attempting to exert authority beyond its legal jurisdiction. It was harassment, pure and simple, and she had put her name right on it. I picked up my phone and called my old friend Mark, who'd been my JAG officer in the Corps and was now a partner at a private law firm. I read him the letter. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, followed by a low whistle. "Jack," he said, his voice laced with the kind of glee only a lawyer looking at a slam-dunk case can muster. "This isn't just stupid. This is beautifully, litigiously stupid. Do not respond. Do not call her. Do not even look in her direction. Just let her keep writing these letters. We're going to let her build our entire case for us." And that's precisely what I did. I filed her letter in a new folder I labeled The Karen Project. 2 weeks later, I conducted another controlled burn, slightly larger this time, following every single protocol to the letter. And just like clockwork, another cream-colored envelope arrived. This one was for $1,000, and the tone was even more shrill. A third burn, a third letter, this time threatening a lawsuit from the HOA's high-powered legal team. The folder was getting thicker. Karen was methodically building the gallows from which she would eventually hang. She had no idea that while she was busy writing her little fantasy legal notices, I was spending my evenings doing what I do best: reconnaissance. I was reading every word of the Whispering Pines covenants, bylaws, and meeting minutes, all of which were publicly available online. I was creating a detailed file on their finances, their contracts, and their leadership. And most importantly, I was identifying the source of her power. It wasn't the rules themselves. It was the ignorance and apathy of the residents who were bound by them. That was the real battleground. And that's where I would focus my counteroffensive. My strategy was twofold. First, I had to establish an irrefutable official record that put Karen and the HOA on notice. Not just that they were wrong, but that their actions constituted legal harassment. Second, I needed to understand the human terrain within the estates at Whispering Pines. An army of one is a losing proposition. I needed allies. For the first part, I followed Mark's advice and drafted a formal, legally precise response. It wasn't an angry letter. It was a cold, factual statement of reality. I spent a full day on it, making it as impenetrable as a fortress wall. I started by citing my property's parcel number and the date of its original plat, contrasting it with the HOA's own founding documents, which clearly delineated the boundaries of their jurisdiction. I included a certified survey map, with my land highlighted in yellow and their territory in red, a stark visual representation of their overreach. Then I addressed the issue of the burns. I attached a copy of my state-issued burn permit, my professional certification as a wildland firefighter Type 2, and a detailed explanation of the fire mitigation plan for my property, citing the relevant state forestry codes that not only allowed but encouraged such activities to prevent catastrophic wildfires. The crown jewel of the letter was the final section. With Mark's guidance, I formally defined their series of letters and fines as a pattern of harassment. I cited the specific state statutes on the matter and stated that any further communication of this nature would be considered intentional infliction of emotional distress and would be met with legal action seeking damages. I didn't threaten, I informed. I laid out the consequences of their actions as an inevitability, a matter of cause and effect. I sent the entire package via certified mail with return receipt requested, addressed not just to Karen, but to every single member of the HOA board, individually, at their home addresses. This wasn't just about Karen anymore. It was about making the entire leadership accountable. They could no longer claim ignorance. They were now officially complicit. While I waited for that to sink in, I moved on to phase 2, gathering intelligence from inside the wire. My property shared about a quarter-mile of fence line with the backyards of several HOA homes. One afternoon, I saw an older gentleman struggling with a lawnmower near the fence. I grabbed a wrench and a can of WD-40 and walked over. His name was Arthur Henderson, a retired accountant who had lived in the neighborhood since it was built. He was quiet, cautious, and clearly intimidated by Karen. But as we worked on the mower, he started talking. He told me about the fines for leaving his garbage cans out for 2 hours too long, the violation notice for having a garden gnome that was deemed aesthetically discordant, the time Karen measured the height of his grass with a ruler. He painted a picture of a community held hostage by petty despotism. "Most of us just pay the fines to make her go away," he said, his voice low. "It's easier than fighting. She lives for the fight." He told me about the upcoming annual HOA meeting, the one where they would vote on the new budget. A budget that, he confided, always included a suspiciously large line item for legal and administrative fees. He was my first contact, my listening post on the inside. A few days later, I met a young couple, the Garcias, who had 2 small children. Their crime? They had installed a swing set that was a shade of blue, not on the pre-approved palette of earth tones. They were stressed, exhausted, and felt powerless. They'd sunk their life savings into this house, and now they were being bled dry by a constant stream of $500 fines for a piece of playground equipment. I listened to their story, offered no solutions, but simply validated their frustration. I let them know they weren't crazy, and they weren't alone. I was planting seeds, building a network of shared grievance. The response from the HOA board to my certified letter was exactly what Mark had predicted. Silence. They didn't rescind the fines, but they didn't send any new ones either. They were in a holding pattern, likely confused and unsure. Karen's primary weapon, the intimidating letter, had been neutralized by a bigger, more legally sound letter. She had fired her cannon, and I had returned fire with a precision-guided missile. But I knew this was just a lull in the storm. A person like Karen doesn't just give up. Her entire identity was wrapped up in her perceived power. A challenge to that power was a challenge to her very existence. She would escalate. I was counting on it. Her next move would be dumber, more public, and would draw more people into the conflict. And when she did, I and my growing network of disillusioned neighbors would be ready. The waiting was the hardest part, but in the military, I'd learned that patience is a strategic asset. You wait, you watch, you gather intel, and you let your enemy make the mistakes. And Karen did not disappoint. The escalation came, as I knew it would, not in the mail but in person, and with a theatrical flair that was pure Karen. She had clearly stewed over my letter, her rage simmering until it boiled over. Her new strategy was to bypass paperwork and move directly to public confrontation and official harassment. She had decided that if her own authority wasn't enough, she would try to leverage the authority of actual law enforcement. It was a Saturday morning. I was clearing a new fire break along the southern edge of my property with a chainsaw, well within my own land. The saw was loud, but not loud enough to miss the sight of a county sheriff's patrol car pulling up to the edge of my driveway, followed closely by Karen's oversized white SUV. She got out of her vehicle before the deputy was even out of his, marching toward me with a triumphant smirk, her binder of HOA rules clutched to her chest like a holy text. This, she clearly believed, was the checkmate. The deputy, a young guy named Miller who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, trudged wearily behind her. "That's him, officer," Karen announced, pointing at me as if she'd just cornered a dangerous fugitive. "He's operating heavy machinery before 10 a.m. on a Saturday, a clear violation of the noise ordinance in our covenants. And look at this." She swept her arm dramatically towards the neatly stacked piles of cleared brush. "He's preparing to start another one of his dangerous, toxic fires." I killed the chainsaw and pulled off my ear protection, waiting calmly. Deputy Miller sighed, the sound of a man who had dealt with Karen before. "Ma'am, his property isn't in your HOA," he said, his voice flat with practiced patience. "Your noise ordinance doesn't apply here, and the county noise ordinance doesn't start until 9 p.m. "But the smoke! The danger!" she sputtered, her face turning a deeper shade of crimson. "It drifts into our community. It affects our property values. It's a public nuisance." I stepped forward, holding up a hand. "Deputy," I said, addressing Miller directly and ignoring Karen completely. "Jack Riley. I own this parcel. Here's my driver's license." He took it and nodded. "I have a multi-day burn permit issued by the State Forestry Commission, valid starting this afternoon, weather permitting. I'm a certified wildland firefighter, and all my fire breaks are up to state code, 50 feet wide and cleared to mineral soil. You're welcome to inspect them." I then looked at him and added, "I'm also the county forestry officer. I'm the one who issues the burn permits for this entire region, including the one for the Whispering Pines common area that your HOA will be applying for next month." A beautiful, profound silence descended. You could see the gears turning in Deputy Miller's head as he processed this new information. His expression shifted from weary annoyance to something approaching quiet amusement. He looked from me to my credentials, then to Karen, whose jaw was now hanging open, her triumphant smirk replaced by a mask of slack-jawed disbelief. He handed me back my license. "Well, sir," he said, a hint of a smile touching his lips. "Looks like you have everything in order." "Ma'am," he turned to Karen, his tone now firm and official, "Mr. Riley is in full compliance with state and county law. This is not a law enforcement matter. Please do not call 911 for issues regarding HOA covenant disputes outside your jurisdiction again. It ties up resources." He turned and walked back to his car, leaving Karen standing in my driveway, sputtering like a car that wouldn't start. She stared at me, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and pure, undiluted hatred. She had tried to use the power of the state against me, and it had backfired spectacularly. Not only had she failed, but she had been publicly dressed down by a uniformed officer in front of her target. Her ultimate weapon had been revealed to be a dud. As the sheriff's car pulled away, she finally found her voice. "This isn't over," she hissed, her voice low and venomous. "I'll find something. I'll read every rule. I will ruin you." She then spun around, marched back to her SUV, and peeled out, kicking up a cloud of gravel. I just stood there letting the dust settle. This was a major victory. She had exposed herself as a crank, a nuisance caller wasting public resources. But more importantly, she had revealed her playbook. When her own rules failed, she would twist public ones. This meant I needed to be more than just right. I needed to be unimpeachable. Every I dotted, every T crossed. While she was busy poring over rule books looking for a loophole, I was going to be poring over her HOA's financial statements. My conversation with Arthur Henderson about the legal and administrative fees had planted a seed, and after this latest stunt, I was ready to see what kind of garden it would grow. She wanted a war of paperwork? Fine. But we wouldn't be fighting on her battlefield of petty covenants. We'd be fighting on mine, the battlefield of public records, budgets, and accountable governance. Karen's public humiliation at the hands of Deputy Miller was the catalyst I needed. It was a visible crack in her armor, and it emboldened the people who had been suffering in silence. My phone started ringing. First, it was Arthur Henderson, who had watched the entire exchange from his living room window. He was practically giddy. "She looked like a fool, Jack. An absolute fool," he chuckled. "I think it's time we took a closer look at those financials I told you about. I have copies of the last 5 years of budgets and expense reports." The next call was from Maria Garcia, the mother from the family with the non-compliant blue swing set. She told me that Karen, in a fit of rage after her defeat, had plastered a new bright orange violation sticker on their swing set and tripled their outstanding fines. They were at their breaking point. "We can't afford this, and we can't afford to move," she said, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and anger. "What can we do?" I told them to document everything, to save every notice, and to not pay a single cent more. I told them a plan was in motion. The dam of fear was breaking, and a current of rebellion was starting to flow. The following evening, I met with Arthur at his house. He spread 5 years of HOA financial documents across his dining room table. As a retired accountant, he saw numbers not just as figures, but as a story. And this story was a dark one. The line item for legal and administrative fees was indeed enormous, growing by nearly 30% each year. But there was more. The landscaping contract for the community's common areas had been awarded, without a competitive bid, to a company called Evergreen Solutions LLC. A quick search on my phone revealed that Evergreen Solutions was registered to a single owner, Karen's brother-in-law. The contract was wildly inflated, costing the homeowners nearly twice the market rate for basic mowing and pruning. Then we found the payments for social committee expenses. Thousands of dollars were being spent on lavish parties for a committee that consisted of Karen and her 2 best friends on the board. We found receipts for high-end catering, expensive floral arrangements, and even a line item for event consultation paid directly to Karen's sister. It was a family and friends slush fund, financed by the exorbitant fees and unjust fines levied against her own neighbors. "This is more than just mismanagement," Arthur said, his face grim as he pointed to a specific invoice. "This is fraud." He had the evidence, the paper trail that proved years of self-dealing and financial abuse. Meanwhile, Maria Garcia was becoming an organizer. She started a private group chat with other young families in the neighborhood, sharing their stories of harassment over swing sets, basketball hoops, and sidewalk chalk. They discovered they weren't isolated cases. They were all targets in Karen's campaign to mold the neighborhood into her sterile, joyless vision. They began to compile a dossier of her abuses, a collection of personal testimonies detailing the emotional and financial toll of her reign. My role shifted from being the direct target to being the strategic coordinator. I was the outside agitator who could operate without fear of direct reprisal from the HOA. I used my military planning skills to organize the information we were gathering. We created a shared digital folder. Arthur uploaded the annotated financial records, Maria uploaded the written testimonies from the families, and I uploaded my own file of her harassment, including my certified letter and a written summary of the incident with the sheriff's department. We were building a comprehensive case, not just against Karen, but against the entire complicit board. Our target was the upcoming annual HOA meeting, now just 3 weeks away. It was typically a sleepy affair, with only Karen, the board, and a handful of retirees in attendance. It was where she would railroad through her budget and solidify her power for another year. This year, however, would be different. We started a quiet proxy campaign. Many residents were too intimidated to confront Karen publicly, but they were more than willing to sign over their vote to someone who would. Arthur and Maria went door to door, not with angry rhetoric, but with quiet, factual conversations. They showed people the landscaping contract. They shared the stories of the families being fined into debt. They explained the legal exposure the HOA faced for harassing a non-member. Slowly, painstakingly, the stack of proxy forms grew. We were assembling an army, not of soldiers, but of voting shares. Karen, blinded by her obsession with me, was completely oblivious to the insurrection brewing within her own borders. She was so focused on the enemy at her gate that she failed to see the one rising up from within her own castle. Her final desperate act of overreach was what sealed her fate, and it was aimed, as always, at me. She filed a formal complaint with my employer, the State Forestry Commission, accusing me of unethical conduct, abuse of power, and endangering her community. It was a bold, stupid move, and it was the last mistake she would ever make as HOA president. The official email from the regional director of the Forestry Commission landed in my inbox on a Monday morning. The subject line was stark: formal complaint and request for investigation. My heart didn't sink. It hardened. This was it. This was the moment she crossed the final line, escalating her personal vendetta into an attack on my professional life and my very livelihood. The complaint was attached as a PDF, and it was a masterpiece of hysterical fiction. In a multi-page, single-spaced tirade, Karen accused me of using my position as county forestry officer to intimidate and terrorize the residents of Whispering Pines. She claimed my controlled burns were a reckless abuse of my authority, conducted not for safety, but as a campaign of targeted harassment. She alleged that I had boasted about my power to deny the HOA their future burn permits, framing it as a form of blackmail. She demanded my immediate suspension and a full ethics investigation. She had signed it, Karen Miller, President, Whispering Pines HOA, on behalf of a concerned and endangered community. It was a declaration of total war. I forwarded the email to Mark, my lawyer, with a simple message: "It's time." Then I began to compose my official response. This wasn't a letter to a deranged HOA president. This was a formal report to my superiors, and it had to be flawless, factual, and utterly devastating. I spent the next 2 days assembling my rebuttal. It was more than a defense. It was a counter-offensive executed on paper. I attached every piece of documentation I had: the initial violation letters from the HOA, my certified response with the survey map, a detailed log of my controlled burns with weather data and safety protocols for each, and a sworn affidavit detailing Karen's confrontations with me, including the incident with Deputy Miller. I also included a professional assessment of the wildfire risk posed by the unmanaged common areas within Whispering Pines itself, complete with photographic evidence of overgrown brush and ladder fuels. I pointed out that my own land management activities actually reduced the fire risk for her community, a service for which they should have been grateful. The final section of my report addressed her core accusation that I had threatened to withhold their burn permit. I stated clearly and professionally that I had never threatened to withhold a valid permit application. What I had stated, and what I was now stating in my official capacity, was that any permit application submitted by the current HOA board under Karen's leadership would be subjected to the highest level of scrutiny due to her documented harassment and demonstrated ignorance of basic fire safety principles. I concluded that I could not, in good conscience, approve a permit for a prescribed burn managed by individuals who viewed fire safety regulations as a tool for personal vendettas. I recommended that the Commission advise the HOA that any future applications would likely require a certified third-party burn boss to be hired at their own expense to ensure safety and compliance, a recommendation that carried significant financial weight. I submitted my report. The regional director, a man I had known and respected for years, called me less than an hour later. "Jack," he said, his voice grim, "I've read your report and the complaint. We have to do our due diligence, so there will be a formal review, but I can already see what this is. You've done everything by the book. Her complaint, on the other hand, is libelous," he paused, "and your recommendation regarding a third-party burn boss for her HOA, that's a brilliant and entirely appropriate measure given the circumstances. We'll be formalizing that as official guidance." The trap had been sprung. By trying to use my own organization against me, Karen had inadvertently invited official state oversight into her own affairs. She had weaponized a process she did not understand, and the recoil was about to be severe. The Forestry Commission's official response to the HOA, a copy of which was sent to me, was a masterclass in bureaucratic takedown. It systematically dismantled Karen's complaint, affirmed that I had acted professionally and within my authority at all times, and formally notified the HOA board of the new requirement for a certified independent burn boss for any future permits, citing the unusual and vexatious nature of their president's conduct. Karen had hoped for a sword to slay me. Instead, she had been handed a bill for thousands of dollars in new, unforeseen expenses for her community. The news of this filtered through the neighborhood like wildfire. Arthur Henderson, armed with this new information, calculated the cost of hiring a private burn contractor versus the cost of hauling away all the common area brush. Either way, it was a massive, unbudgeted expense that would necessitate a special assessment. a direct tax on every single homeowner, all because of Karen's personal crusade. The annual meeting was now just a week away. We had the proxies, we had the financial evidence, we had the testimonies. And now we had the undeniable proof that Karen's leadership was not just petty and abusive, but financially catastrophic for the very people she claimed to represent. The stage was set for a reckoning. The night of the annual HOA meeting felt charged, like the air before a thunderstorm. The meeting was held in the community clubhouse, a sterile, beige room that usually saw no more than a dozen attendees. Tonight it was packed. Nearly 100 homeowners filled the folding chairs, a sea of anxious and angry faces. Maria Garcia and the other young families sat together, a united front. Arthur Henderson sat near the front, a neat stack of financial documents in a binder on his lap. And I, the non-member, the catalyst, stood quietly in the back, an observer who had been invited by several residents to witness the proceedings. My presence alone was a statement. Karen and her two bored cronies, a pair of women who looked like paler, quieter versions of Karen herself, sat at a long table at the front of the room. Karen seemed oblivious to the mood, or perhaps she was simply high on her own sense of power. She beamed at the large turnout, likely interpreting it as a testament to her popular leadership. She opened the meeting with a gavel bang that echoed in the tense silence. "Welcome, everyone. It's so wonderful to see so many engaged community members here tonight," she chirped, her voice oozing a false sweetness that was almost more offensive than her usual shrillness. She tried to breeze through the initial agenda items, the reading of last year's minutes, the report from the social committee, which consisted of her bragging about the success of her catered parties. But the crowd was restless. When she moved to the main event, the presentation and approval of the new annual budget, Arthur Henderson stood up. "Madam President," he said, his voice calm but firm, "I have a question regarding the budget line item for landscaping and grounds maintenance." Karen's smile tightened. "Of course, Arthur. What is it?" "The proposed budget allocates $150,000 to Evergreen Solutions, LLC. I've obtained 3 independent quotes for the same services from reputable local companies. The highest of those quotes was for $85,000. Could you explain the $65,000 discrepancy?" A murmur went through the crowd. Karen's face began to pale. "Evergreen Solutions has been our trusted partner for years," she stammered. "They provide a premium service." "Are you aware," Arthur continued, his voice rising slightly, "that the sole proprietor of Evergreen Solutions is your brother-in-law, Mr. David Miller?" The murmur grew into an audible gasp. Karen's face was now a blotchy red. "That is a private family matter. It has no bearing on their excellent work." Before she could recover, Maria Garcia stood up. "I have a question about the legal and administrative fees," she said, holding a sheaf of papers. "This budget calls for a $50,000 allocation. My neighbors and I have calculated that over the past year, this board has issued over $20,000 in frivolous fines just to the families on my street for things like children's toys and swing sets. Is the purpose of the legal fund to harass families and finance the president's personal vendettas against non-members?" She gestured to me at the back of the room. All eyes turned to me, then back to Karen. The room was electric. People started shouting questions. "Why are our fees paying for your parties? Who approved the contract with your brother-in-law? How much money have you spent harassing that man?" Karen banged her gavel furiously. "Order! Order! These are baseless accusations. This is not the proper forum." But she had lost control. The dam had burst. This was the moment I had been waiting for. I stepped forward from the back of the room. The crowd parted, letting me walk to the front. I wasn't a member, and I had no right to speak, but nobody stopped me. I stood before the table and placed a single piece of paper in front of Karen. It was the letter from the State Forestry Commission. "That letter," I said, my voice carrying easily through the now silent room, "is the direct result of your president filing a false and malicious complaint against me with my employer. Please read the final paragraph aloud." Karen stared at the paper, her hand trembling. She refused to pick it up. So I did. I turned to the crowd and read it for her. "Due to the conduct of the current HOA board president, which demonstrates a clear lack of understanding of and respect for state fire safety protocols, any future burn permit applications from the Whispering Pines HOA will require the hiring of a certified and insured third-party burn boss to oversee the planning and execution of any prescribed fire on HOA common property. I lowered the letter and looked at the assembled homeowners. I've done a little research. A certified burn boss and their team will cost you, at minimum, $15,000 to clear the brush in your common areas. Alternatively, hauling it all to a landfill will cost you closer to $40,000. That is a new unbudgeted expense that you will all have to pay, either through a special assessment or a massive hike in your dues. And it is a direct result of your president's personal obsession. She has weaponized your money, your rules, and now, state agencies. The question you have to ask yourselves is not just about the money, it's about the liability she has exposed you all to. Her actions taken in your name constitute a textbook case of corporate harassment. I pause, letting the weight of the word liability sink in. Your legal and administrative budget isn't going to cover the lawsuit that's coming if this continues. A man in the front row, a lawyer who lived in the neighborhood, stood up. "He's right," he said gravely. "The D&O insurance for the board will not cover actions taken in bad faith. If he sues, and he will win, the judgment could be levied against the HOA's assets or against every homeowner individually." Panic started to ripple through the room. Karen looked around, her eyes wild, searching for an ally, but she found none. The faces staring back at her were filled with anger, betrayal, and fear. Her power, built on a foundation of bluff and intimidation, had crumbled to dust in a matter of minutes, exposed by simple, undeniable facts. Arthur Henderson stepped forward again. "Madam President," he said, his voice resonating with newfound authority, "I believe it is time for a motion from the floor. I move for a vote of no confidence in the President and the entire current Board of Directors." The lawyer in the front row immediately seconded the motion. The room erupted in a chorus of "ayes." Karen just sat there, shrunken, her gavel silent in her hand. Her reign was over. The vote was a formality, a landslide. Karen and her two board members were removed from their positions by an overwhelming majority, a decision punctuated by a smattering of applause and a palpable, collective sigh of relief. She didn't say a word. She simply gathered her binder, her face a pale, slack mask of defeat, and walked out of the clubhouse, leaving the remnants of her petty empire scattered on the table behind her. The aftermath was swift and decisive. An interim board was elected on the spot, with Arthur Henderson unanimously voted in as the new president. His first act was to formally and publicly apologize to me on behalf of the community. His second was to declare all outstanding fines issued under Karen's tenure for aesthetic violations, the swing sets, the garden gnomes, the trash cans, null and void. A wave of joy and relief washed over the families who had been living under that financial threat for months. The next day, Arthur, along with the new treasurer, sat down with me. We went over the plan for their common areas. They were genuinely concerned about the fire risk Karen had ignored for years, while she was busy policing lawn ornaments. I walked the property with them, pointing out the areas of highest concern, explaining the principles of defensible space and fuel mitigation. I laid out the exact steps they needed to take to bring their property into compliance with state fire codes. There was no talk of my position or my authority. It was just a neighbor helping neighbors. I helped them draft a new, responsible land management plan. It was practical, affordable, and focused on safety, not aesthetics. They organized community work days, and dozens of residents came out with chainsaws, rakes, and gloves. People who had barely spoken to each other before were now working side by side, clearing brush, laughing, and getting to know one another. The Garcia's blue swing set became a popular gathering spot for the kids. The oppressive cloud of suspicion and petty tyranny had lifted, replaced by a genuine sense of community. Once their mitigation work was complete, the new HOA board submitted their application for a controlled burn permit. It was perfect. They had followed every guideline, documented every step. I reviewed it, signed off on it, and issued the permit without hesitation. On the day of the burn, I didn't just issue the permit, I showed up. I brought my own gear and spent the day working alongside Arthur and a dozen other volunteer homeowners, helping them manage the fire lines, ensuring everything was done safely and professionally. We weren't an HOA and an outsider. We were just people, working together to protect our homes. We learned that Karen and her husband put their house on the market less than a month after the meeting. The public humiliation, the loss of her power, and the open animosity from the neighbors she had tormented for years were too much for her to bear. They moved away, and a new, younger family moved in, one who was thrilled to learn about the relaxed and neighborly atmosphere of the community. The Evergreen Solutions landscaping contract was terminated, and a new company was hired for nearly half the price, with the savings being passed directly back to the homeowners in the form of a dues reduction. The new board, under Arthur's guidance, rewrote the most restrictive and ridiculous parts of the covenants, focusing the HOA's mission on what it was supposed to be about: maintaining shared property and ensuring safety, not legislating personal taste. The legal and administrative budget was slashed, repurposed into a fund for community improvement projects. My life returned to the quiet peace I had sought when I first bought my land. The legal folder labeled the Karen Project was moved to a storage box in my attic, a relic of a battle fought and won. Sometimes on a cool evening, I'll light a small, contained fire in my pit, the same one where this whole saga began. The smoke curls up into the night sky, no longer a symbol of conflict, but of peace, of hard-won freedom. Occasionally, Arthur will walk over to the fence line, and we'll share a beer and talk about the weather or the price of lumber. We never talk about Karen. We don't have to. The victory wasn't just in her defeat. It was in the community that rose from the ashes of her tyranny, stronger, friendlier, and more united than ever before. I had set out to protect my own property and my own peace, but in the end, the fight had been for something bigger. It was a fight for the simple idea that neighbors should help each other, that rules should serve people, not the other way around, and that a little bit of common sense and decency can, and always will, triumph over the loudest, most entitled voice in the room. And the smell of wood smoke on my own land has never smelled sweeter.